The following is a conversation with a man named Michal. He does have a second name. It's very difficult to pronounce. We discuss it in the show. He struggles himself, so don't shoot the messenger. He's currently the chief architect at Codesphere, but over the last decade, he's been working at Google on their many platforms, including Google Mail, Google Maps, and YouTube. We have an awesome conversation with Michal about many different topics. We discuss what lured him to the world of startups, why it's different from working at Google, the lessons that fit from Google, the lessons that don't, how he runs a team, all sorts of things. If you're interested in technology, into development, into startups, this is the episode for you. The podcast is brought to you, as always, by Codesphere. Check out more about Codesphere at codesphere.com. And please subscribe to the podcast everywhere you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. Enjoy the show.
So today we're going to talk a lot about developer experience. We're going to talk about how it's changed, how the current landscape is for developers, and what maybe the future of that might hold. And to help us do that, we have Michal. Michal, I've just realised I can pronounce your first name very well now.
Yeah, but you have no idea about my second name, right?
No, now I see it. Now I see it in front of me. It's quite daunting. But how can you please introduce yourself to save me the embarrassment?
Yeah, so my name is Michal Gornisiewicz.
Gornisiewicz.
Yeah, and I can tell you, having spent most of my life outside of my home country, or my country of birth, Poland, it's not just the people who pronounce my name that struggle. I also struggle with having this name.
I also struggled.
Yeah. So, tell us a little bit about yourself. You were obviously born in Poland. Who are you? Where have you been?
So I moved to Australia actually when I was quite young. So I actually grew up in Australia, which is, I guess my home country now, in a way. Yeah. But I've also lived in Switzerland the last decade, so it's a bit of a mix. I studied in Australia. I studied physics, computer science, electrical and electronic engineering. And then I mostly worked as a software engineer developer for most of the entirety of my career in various areas. And especially the last decade where I've been living in Zurich. I've been working at Google here in Zurich.
That's a big list of things to have studied: physics, computer science, and electronical engineering.
So it's a double degree with a double major in science. That's where the computer science and physics comes from. And I went and found the most difficult thing I could do. And did it.
Do you ever reach back to those days and you're like, now I remember learning that in my computer science degree. I'm so glad I remembered that class. Do you ever apply it?
I think computer science was the easy stuff. I think, and physics was the really hard stuff. But I think what I really appreciated was the maths, because that's where you felt you learned stuff. But I think there are parallels from, I think the varied background gives me insights which are more difficult to come by otherwise. Yeah. And I certainly remember some of the struggles, because I often had twice as many exams as the normal person.
Man. I think me and Tim took the path of choosing the most difficult thing we could, and that's led us to being podcast hosts.
we
come a long way.
That's awesome.
Every episode is an exam. Trying to pronounce the surnames of guests is
that's our cheat. Is get the guest to say their own surname.
All right. So you've recently joined Codesphere, and what are you doing there?
So I'm a chief architect, and what that means is, I guess, in the startup, it's less precise, because I think in the startup you do almost everything that you need to do, so you get a varied. But basically, I'm largely responsible for making sure that the architecture of our systems is well done and makes sense. I'm responsible for making sure that our development process is sound and and that we have sort of high quality output, but at the same time that we have high velocity and that we're moving along.
What's the difference between a chief architect and a CTO?
I think the chief architect is more of a technical role, more directly in the sort of hands-on stuff, whereas the CTO is more like understanding the technological landscape outside of the company and seeing how the company fits into that. But I think in a startup, it's all a little bit blended.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And do you have a CTO at Codesphere? Do you work alongside, or is it?
We don't have a CTO, I believe, right now. Yeah.
All right. So tell us a little bit about what you did at Google then, if that's what you're doing at Codesphere. How does that change? How's that?
Actually, before we go on, because I think actually the chief architect part from a sort of startup point of view is really interesting. Because I didn't really know about this role until you wrote it. So, I mean, is it quite a common role in startups? Is it something that you would recommend if someone was going down the sort of like a tech startup route, that they should ensure that they have a chief architect?
Yeah, so I think maybe more classically this role is performed by someone titled CTO, but I think it's a bit of a mix and a blend, and it depends on whether your company is heavily tech-based and not, right? So if you are, the CTO is more of a sort of managerial position, whereas the chief architect is more of a technically rooted position. And so I think you need one of those people to be around.
Yeah, for sure.
And depending on the size of the company, you may have both. But it depends, I think, specifically on what your company is doing and whether it's sort of, putting together existing technologies and needs a lot of that, or really sort of developing more greenfield kind of stuff and needs the more stronger technical background. That's how I take it. But, I can't say I've got a lot of experience in this, right? Like, that's every company creates their positions to fit what they need.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess the more flexible the team is, the more likely you are to have to wear the many hats and do the management and the technical side as well.
Yeah, and so I think the distinction at a startup is not super important.
Yeah, for sure.
You do what needs to get done.
I guess with the definition of the roles, it makes the context switching a little bit less stressful, because I guess those two, switching between a chief architect role and a CTO role as like a manager, that must be really difficult to sort of flick between those two.
Yeah, I guess, but even sort of as a chief architect, a lot of the role is about mentorship.
Okay.
And so, maybe focus more on the technical side of things, but nevertheless, there's a very large mentorship, I think, at least at this size of company play. And so it's not as different or distinct as I think you would think. I think the chief architect position is more inner focused, and the CTO architect would be sort of more externally focused. That's how I would see it.
That's an interesting definition. Yeah, that mentoring element is really interesting as well, isn't it? Because I feel like it can get really lost within the kind of day-to-day grind. But then, having someone there that you can kind of look to kind of guide and steer and just kind of work with along when you're coding is really useful.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish I had that 20 years ago.
You need to hire a chief architect so you can be mentored.
No, I mean, look, when I started developing, how many people were around that had 20 years of experience? We think, sort of the information sort of revolution has been around for a while now, but when I was starting, it was still reasonably new. Right? The internet was not something that everyone was necessarily day-to-day familiar with. Right?
A developer with 20 plus years experience now hasn't really been possible for that long.
Yeah,
right.
That's what a lot of people say about Web3 architecture. So it's just like there's nowhere to Google. Like there's no Stack Overflow for Web3 because it hasn't been created yet. It's only been born recently.
All right. So now tell us a little bit about your position at Google. What were you doing there?
So I was doing software engineering pretty much exclusively in various areas. I spent my sort of initial days in Maps. initially on spelling correction and then on road traffic, mostly road traffic data.
Spelling correction on maps is a massive job. Just check every street name.
I was sitting there and looking at all the queries and just making sure that, removing letters there and adding
just spinning there. Google Earth every morning and stopping somewhere and checking.
Yeah. Capital S for street, capital R for road.
Exactly.
But what were you actually doing, like, programmatically with that? Surely you weren't just like checking it against a map.
I'm sure he wasn't.
We're about to find out.
I'm going to leave it at that. I think that's a good. Let's go with that. I think that's a good
it's
description.
More mysterious.
I think
just like a big road atlas.
Yeah. Just a huge fold-out map, loads of paper everywhere.
Yeah,
I thought you were a software engineer. You've got so many maps in here.
Yeah, that's dope.
So maps was sort of my early days, and I can sort of personally say that I still think it's really the coolest product that Google has. I think the most useful one. But then I moved on and I spent a little bit of time in SRE, where I worked mostly on sort of internal configuration languages and related tooling and performance.
What does SRE stand for?
Site Reliability Engineer.
Okay.
So basically, it's someone who is typically responsible for fixing stuff when it goes down.
Ooh, wow!
But also making sure the systems around that. Around monitoring and alerting and related things are in order and built and so on. So and right. That best practices for reliable systems are followed and things like this. So
okay.
After that, I spent some time in Gmail, where I worked on sort of large data, sort of mostly logs, metric processing pipelines. And specifically, really, the systems that deal with managing these kind of pipelines, scheduling and running and backfilling and things like this.
Still got that Aussie accent there in data. There's the data.
Not intentional, but I'm glad. I fear that I've lost it.
Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine what is like a Polish, Australian, Swiss hybrid accent.
It's very terrible. I think it changes when I move. So if I go visit my family and I come back, I think it comes back a little bit.
I have a terrible habit of reflecting people's accents subconsciously, and it comes across as very rude.
That's fine. Look, I like it because I think last time I was visiting Australia, somebody asked me where I'm from, which at that point in time is like, here. I'm actually here.
Literally,
kind of. So after that, I spent some time in YouTube in developer experience, largely working on sort of distributed integration testing. And that's actually where I met Elias, the CEO of the company. So he was interning there with our team at the time. Then the last few years I spent in the team inside Core Systems, working on a couple of productionization frameworks that Google has to sort of standardize and improve the productionization and the release of pretty much everything inside Google.
So you did a lot all around kind of Google internally as well.
I got a large mix of various stuff. Not really anything super user-facing, but certainly user-affecting and a bunch of internal system things and developer experience. And so it was certainly an interesting time. It's always fun. It's always fun when you sort of move on to a different team project and you have this sort of time where you're just learning new stuff and ramping up and getting sort of a different perspective on things. Mm-hmm. So I think I enjoyed that a lot.
This might be a really stupid question. There are no stupid questions, but this might be the first one. Behind the scenes, is the architecture for those different platforms very different from each other? Or hopping between Maps and Google and Gmail and YouTube, is it now I'm just easily working on YouTube and now I'm easily working in Gmail?
No, it is very different. I mean, for example, YouTube, you can imagine that it's different because YouTube was an acquired company.
Yeah.
And so it actually started outside of Google. And while, it got Googlerized, so to speak, over time, certainly when I was there, the sort of the historical I guess, the historical differences were very still apparent. Like YouTube was a system written in Python, and it was really the only system at Google, large-scale system at Google written in Python. So, for example, that was something completely different. And so yes, there are similarities and there are things that are standardized, and there are a lot of the development process is more or less the same. But yes, architecturally, fundamentally, they tend to all be different. And most of the systems are just different systems. Like if you compare Maps to Gmail, they're very, very different.
Yeah, of course.
Things. And so, no, it's not something that, you don't... I mean, on day one, hopefully you start making a contribution, but it's not like you suddenly feel like an expert.
Yeah.
Every time you switch sort of to a completely different area, you need to ramp up, you need to learn how stuff works and what's going on and so on. And it does take time, but it's fun.
So what kind of lured you then to the world of startups from Google? What made you think, I'll go to just the chaotic world of ambiguous positions in startups?
I mean, so I think there are many factors here. It's not sort of one magical thing. But I think after being so long at one company, one starts to wonder, hey, what is it like doing something different? And I think personally, I've kind of realized that until you try something, you don't really know what it's like. So, you can imagine all you want, but until you do it, you don't really know what it's like. So that's one reason. But also, it's kind of cool to have an opportunity to build something new from scratch. And I think one of the things that, working at Google, most of the time, or pretty much all of this time, you're working on existing systems that have their own history, that have their own kind of design and legacy. And it doesn't feel like you can make a huge difference sometimes, simply because the parts you're building are small parts, which are part of a much larger system. And so it feels like it's difficult to make really large changes, really sort of, and so I thought, at a startup, you have a lot more, and I've certainly already felt it, you have a lot more ability to improve things for the entire company. The company is small, so obviously that's a lot easier. If you wanted to improve something for the entirety of Google, that's a challenge. But still, that feeling that you can have, you can change the direction here or there, you can improve this process, and then the entire company sees an improvement from it. And it happens quite quickly, and it gets taken up. I think that's satisfying so far, and I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to try something else.
Does that come with experience as well? Were you kind of like, okay, I've been in this world for long enough that I can jump into a completely different kind of atmosphere and role and really kind of just happy to make mistakes basically and just kind of learn from what happens?
Yeah, I think after you've been around in a certain area, you start to feel slowly over time as, some kind of expert, some kind of knowledgeable person, and then you feel like you can contribute. You feel like at some point in time, you start to feel like you know what you're doing.
Still waiting for that.
Yeah. Check back in 20 years.
And then you see and you look at the people and you think back, yeah, I used to do similar things. I used to make similar mistakes. I used to do similar approaches, and I think there is some satisfaction in helping people sort of grow and learn. Especially those who are sort of responsive and motivated and ambitious. And so I think, after a while you feel like you know what you're doing. not in every single field, but I think also part of that is you start to recognize that it's okay not to know everything, and it's okay not to know what you're doing in every single little aspect, and to recognize where you do have expertise and where you don't, and be able to work with people to move things forward.
I guess that's a kind of a big part of a startup culture as well, where there's the whole kind of mantra of moving fast and breaking things, but also just like moving fast in the right direction and knowing that you're going in the right direction, even though you might be breaking things, is really important. And I guess that only comes with experience. So you can't just be kind of like, the whole team can't just be green, can't just be like a beginner or like, just kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, just excited to be working on the project. There's got to be some level of expertise to make sure things are going in the right direction.
And I think the benefit of experience is that you've seen a lot of things. You've seen a lot of patterns and things happen, and you kind of have an idea of where things can go wrong and how they can go wrong, and that allows you to sort of short circuit these things and get rid of them before they go wrong.
Yeah,
and also to sort of weigh up what is important and what is not, because that's also a challenge.
That's one of the things that first excited me about web development, was that there's like with it's the difference between like the soft skills and the hard skills of like just having that time in the industry and learning. Because with the other roles, especially on the operations side or like even CEO level, like passion can get you so far. If you're just unbelievably passionate about your product or what you're working on, then it can really push you to kind of get what you're doing over the line. But with in the world of like web development and architecture, you've really got to like grind up the levels to get to the point where you can make those decisions, which I think is really cool.
Are there any lessons from Google that you're finding apply really well now you're in the startup world of Codesphere?
Yeah, I think so. There are various lessons that I got from Google itself, and simply stuff that I picked up while being at Google.
In the school of life.
In the school of life, to some extent. And I can tell you, I'll try to throw a few things that I think are important.
Before you say, actually, I was gonna. It sounds like you said. There's a few things that I picked up from Google. Like I just Googled them.
Sure, why not? Let's go with that. That's how you learn things these days, isn't it? Like in my day, you used to go to school. I hear that doesn't happen anymore.
That's weirdly profoundly true. Yeah.
I was talking to my friend yesterday, whose girlfriend's just finished an acupuncture degree, and she's been learning to be an acupuncturist for 3.5 years. And it's just like, I don't know, you especially think about the field that we're in, and like, web development and this kind of startup culture, especially, like 3.5 years is so long to achieve anything. Like that's the level of education in a medical field. Like blew my mind. It's crazy. Sorry, I sidetracked a little bit there, so carry on.
Yeah. So what did I learn? I think one important thing is that mistakes can be very, very costly. And this is something that needs to be balanced when you're, moving and breaking stuff, right? There are certain things that it's okay to do fast and to not do super carefully, and other things that are not. And certainly at Google, there are stories of certain systems going down where people who are trying to bring them up can be under significant stress, because the financial losses can be sort of millions or maybe even tens of millions of dollars per minute, or of that sort of order of magnitude, where it's sort of incredible. So mistakes can be costly, and so not all mistakes and not all kinds of mistakes, but some can be very costly. So that's important to know.
Pressure.
No pressure.
Yeah, if you're a young developer out there.
And so I think it's difficult to know, but you sort of gain just a little bit of experience. Is like, how do you move fast, but doing it safely, right? So because moving fast and making lots of mistakes can in the end mean that you move slowly.
Yeah.
And so finding that right balance and how to do it, I think.
It's definitely something that I've been kind of learning recently. It's not just building stuff fast. It's like building it in a certain way that then means that you can reuse it, or you can add it to other projects, or like, you know, how you kind of can retool it, or, you know, all that kind of stuff is so valuable. It's not necessarily like getting it out to the customer as fast as you can, because then behind the scenes it looks like a mess.
Yeah, absolutely. It needs to be workable. It needs to be maintainable, and you need to do it in a way that you don't accumulate sort of bugs and issues that then take you days or weeks to fix later on.
Yeah. Interestingly, like a counterpoint to that, I was at a talk about continuous discovery last night, about like continuously iterating, and he brought up a really good point that if you ask two teams of people to create the same product, and one of them has to create as many as they can, and the other one has to create it as best as they can, the one who creates them as fast as they can ends up having a much better product because they iterate again and again and again and make small changes. And the other one will get stuck in this like perfectionism development process. So there's a real fine balance trying to develop fast and slow.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think here I'm not making the point that you should aim for perfectionism, because iterating a lot is still a good idea. But you can iterate in a way where you're constantly making improvements, and you can iterate in a way where you're accumulating bugs and issues over time.
Second one's the better one, right?
Absolutely, yeah. More bugs is better, I heard.
They're not bugs, they're features.
A nice big collection of bugs. Yeah. But I guess that also links back to what we were talking about with Elias before, a couple of episodes ago, where we were talking about this whole need for validation. You know, you can't just kind of like start building something without user feedback or design feedback. So I guess that's where the gray area is, because if the product is more design or user focused, then you can iterate as much as you want, but like you might need the finalized product before you can like actually kind of get it out the door. So I guess it's all part of a bigger user flow, or just a product flow, I guess.
Yeah. So some other things, I think measuring is important, and this goes back to more or less what you just said. You need to sort of have an idea of what you're doing makes sense, and if it works, and how well it works. And some of the measurements is obviously coming from users, and some of it are things like performance measures and metrics, and even metrics that look at how well your development process is going and where you can make improvements. And so in general, if you want to make improvements, you need to measure, and you need to have some way of verifying that what you're doing, you know, is actually taking you in the right direction.
Could you give us an example of some of those, especially within the dev team?
So I mean, for example, you can something that you could measure, for example, is how long it takes on average for a PR to go from first review to being merged into the branch. Yeah. Right. So how efficient is that process? That would be, for example, a metric you could use for a developer experience.
Yeah.
That's an interesting one, because there must be a golden ratio. It's not like if you do it in 5 minutes, that's necessarily good.
No, and it's a little bit subtle, right? Because if you're doing small PRs and you're doing ginormous PRs, those two things are not necessarily equivalent. And so another thing you want to look at is PR size and things like that. So it's rarely, I think it's important that a single metric will give you all the information.
Yeah.
And I will actually talk about this a little bit later.
Cool.
Stuff that's important is that you learn from your mistakes. And I think everyone is human, and we all have to accept that, and everyone makes mistakes, and that's okay. But the key thing is that you then have a process for learning from these mistakes. And so one example, obviously, is, every single company has outages and things go wrong. But the ones that I think do better is the ones that use these situations to then improve their systems and learn from those sort of outages and problems to make things better. And so I think this kind of philosophy of constantly learning from your mistakes and constantly improving, trying to always do things a little bit better, it helps in the long run to build better products, to be more effective, to be more efficient. And I guess one final thing, which is very much Google thing, I think, and maybe something that Google is even known for, and that is to value the people who work for you. And I think that's incredibly important because, in the industry that we're in, our biggest resource are actually our people.
Yeah.
Our developers, but not only our developers, everyone who is part of the startup makes a contribution. And it's important that you think about their well-being because in the long run, people who don't have great well-being will either leave the company or will not be effective and productive.
That's true, yeah.
And more even philosophically, I don't really want to work for a company that doesn't value its people.
Yeah, of course. Do you think it's hard, especially in development, to make sure that the values of everybody are taken care of? Because I feel like developers have obviously sometimes got quite a broad range of like wants and needs as an employee.
Yeah, I think it's not easy, especially also that development often comes to a lot of conflict. Conflict is almost a part of the process. And so it's important that everybody feels that, their work and contribution is valued, but also just their opinion is valued. And also, their free time outside of work and who they are and how they interact with others. All these things should be respected.
I think culture is like it's not something I guess that might get focused on at an early stage of a startup, but it's one of those things that really like persists, I think, and it carries it through because it's so hard to build good culture if you don't start it from a really early point.
Yeah, that's right. I agree. Well, that's a lot of things that you took from Google that do apply kind of to the startup world as well, but there must be a lot of things from massive, huge, corporate companies like that just don't fit in the world of startups. There must be a bunch of stuff you've taken from your time there that just, do not apply here.
Yeah, so I mean, the kind of obvious thing is that at Google, you're almost always working on global scale infrastructure or applications that are serving sort of hundreds of millions or billions of users. And so there is, a lot of process and a lot of red tape and a lot of stuff around this to get this going. And also you need to be then really careful, right? Because if you break something, that's going to affect potentially hundreds of millions of people, right? And so I think those things are less important in the startup world, especially when you're developing a new product that's not really being relied upon yet and so on. I imagine, at some point in time, you still get to the stage where you have a customer base that is relying on you, and then you need to do similar things. But, I don't envisage that, Codesphere is going to be serving hundreds of millions of users tomorrow or even this month. So it will take a while to get there. So, Google now has a large sort of management structure, and how they do this, I think it doesn't apply so well to the startup world. I can certainly tell you that, I knew my manager last I worked at Google. I knew his manager, but then I had several more people up the chain that I'd never really interacted with. And in Codesphere, as someone, starting recently, I still have the ability to meet every single person in the company.
Yeah.
And so the structure and the management chain and, everybody in the company feels completely okay to just come to me and ask me questions or ask me to do, to work with them on something. And I think that's great. I think at this level, it's something that, wasn't the same, at least at a large corporation.
So just this like ability to connect with, really connect with the rest of the team and then like create relationships and working relationships is just much, much harder in a place like Google.
Yeah, and you are siloed and sort of often or at times you work with other teams and sometimes across time zone boundaries, and at that point in time, every team has their own priorities, and those priorities are not necessarily aligned. And getting that alignment, I think, is difficult in a large corporation, and in a startup, I think it's a lot easier, or at least at the size that we're at.
Yeah, I can't imagine that that sort of feeling of working with an expansive team like that, and then also trying to kind of give it more of your personality and character, as opposed to just sort of like just doing your tasks, like clocking in, clocking out. Even though you might be writing code for like Google Maps or something like that millions and millions of people are going to see it. It might does it start feeling mechanic at some point, or
imagine make a spelling mistake on Google Maps and millions of people see it. Imagine the consequences of misspelling a street name on something like Google Maps when people use it to get to work, or they use it to go somewhere. And it's spelled.
I think in my early days there was some emergency I had to help handle. I don't remember the details, but I think it was something like the language in Barcelona was set wrong, like it was defaulting to Spanish instead of Catalan. And
they're a bit touchy about that.
And as an ignorant person, not growing up in Europe at that point in time, that was when I first learned that in Barcelona that there is such a thing as Catalan, and that Barcelona is different. So things like that happen, and I think. One of the things is that, we have a bunch of software engineers working on these products. They're not all really domain experts, right? Like they're not experts on the entire world.
Yeah.
Right. And so being able to, when I was doing spelling correction, if I had to do things in other languages, I had to get other people who are native speakers of those languages to help me. There's no way, I could have checked that something made sense if it was like, I don't know, in Arabic, for instance.
Yeah.
So that's different. So I think if we go back to lessons that don't apply, I mentioned measurement before, and that's important. But what I found from my experience at Google is that Google tends to be very data-centric and oriented, which is great. But there is, in my opinion, not enough emphasis on interpretation of the data and understanding what it means. Because it's all good to have a metric, it's all good to have some numbers. But unless you understand what the downsides of a given data set are, whether it's a significant data set, a significant result, you might not interpret it correctly, and a lot of it isn't interpretation. And this kind of brings me back a little bit to my physics days. Physics is kind of about understanding the world, and it's a lot of maths. But in the end, the really key thing to physics is understanding how to interpret the results of the maths and how they apply to the real world. And so I think the lesson I wouldn't take from Google is to create some kind of religion around data without having some kind of system where you're able to teach people how to interpret the data. Like nuance is important.
And when you say data in terms of Google, I think a lot of listeners are going to presume you're talking about like user data or like all that kind of stuff, that privacy data.
No.
But what is it that you actually mean?
I mean, sort of. Typically, I mean some kind of metric that tells you whether something is good or bad.
Okay,
that's typical.
And is that like kind of like internally set metrics, or is it just like things going wrong or right, or uptime, downtime, or things like that?
Everything.
Okay,
everything like this. From things like how much is your product used, to how accurate we are, to how often things break.
Yeah.
At any level, really. To how happy are your reports with your manager, and this kind of stuff.
Okay, yeah.
Things like this. So at every level, and Google is good at sort of collecting data and making sure that at every point there is some data and some metrics that try to measure what's going on. But I think where it's less good at is interpreting and understanding what that stuff means, and does it actually mean anything? Can you draw any conclusion from a given sort of data set is it significant.
Yeah, I guess that's one of that kind of nuance in the workplace is obviously very difficult with a huge company like Google, but it's also quite difficult with the whole pandemic. I think it's one of the things that's been most hard with the remote working is it's hard to kind of like just get a rain check on the vibe and feeling in your company, I suppose. So if you're all working remotely and you're just doing your tasks and you're not really sort of feeling the culture, or maybe the tickets are getting ticked off, but like as you say, is it being interpreted correctly? That must be very hard.
Yeah, I imagine so. Yeah. For me, I think the whole pandemic experience working from home was not too bad, but I know for some people it wasn't ideal, and I can imagine sort of as a manager in these kind of circumstances, it was certainly very difficult to get a feel for how everyone is doing.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get into it then. Let's talk a little bit about the developer experience, specifically like the classical developer experience. Obviously, you and I are both working for Codesphere, which is really trying to push this new development process onto the world, championing it. I mean, it exists to some extent, but what's your take on the classic developer experience against this new like cloud development movement that we're seeing?
Yeah, so I think if we start off with what is classical developer experience, so we're on the same page, we're kind of thinking about, individual computers, a user having their IDE or text editor or whatever, and a compiler or some kind of build system, and perhaps they have some kind of shared version control system online, but chiefly they have a single machine on which they're working, and they're working on code that either have a copy of the code base or some portion of that code base. Mm-hmm. Whereas I guess in the cloud direction, everything can be shared in some way, and you're no longer limited to the resources of a single machine. That's how I would see the differences between the two setups. And I think this kind of idea of having a shared environment where the code is potentially shared, where the resources are potentially shared, where you have potentially a lot more resources available to you, and that opens up some opportunities for improvement, I think.
Mm-hmm. How would you say it's really changed then in the last kind of 10 years? Has the classical experience really changed at all since the 80s, the 90s?
I think really fundamentally it hasn't. It's still kind of the same process. You write code, you test it, you build it, you run it on something. But of course there are aspects that have changed. Compilers languages in particular have improved and changed. There's now much more, many more standard libraries that do things that are available. People have built stuff over the last 4 decades since the 80s. It's not like we're all beginning fresh. There are more standard technologies. One recent example is, say, web components. I remember back in the 90s when, JavaScript, or the thing you did with JavaScript was make buttons have this hover effect over the buttons where they would highlight if you moved your cursor over that. That was sort of state-of-the-art JavaScript in those days. And so what you can do on the web has obviously changed, and even changed over the last decade. How well you can write complicated applications has improved. But also in general, I think the level of complexity has increased. Things are now much bigger, much more complicated. Take longer to develop, take longer to build.
Because they're trying
more difficult to understand.
Do you think it's because they're trying to achieve more, or is it just because is the scope changed, or why do you think that might be?
I think it's a multitude of factors. One of them, we now have more complicated software, right? More advanced software. If you take obviously something like Google Maps and compare it to the equivalent 20 years ago, what's the equivalent 20 years ago? Paper map, really, right? Maybe an image or something, right?
Yeah.
If you take something like Google Search, the number of web pages that it indexed and how fast it could do it, and so on like this. You didn't have phones that you can have in your pocket and that you could talk to and stuff like this. So certainly technology and software has advanced. But that also means that, it has more components, it's more complicated. And, with the availability of different libraries and tooling, there comes a cost. You have to learn these things, and you have to understand them, and you have to, and sometimes, they can move and change quickly. So I think, and I think also additionally, you now these days work with a lot more people, right? Companies the size of the big tech giants, they didn't really do software 20 years ago. So I think that's where the complexity is coming from. And I think it's going to continue to grow.
So you think the developer experience should improve from what it is right now? You think it needs to improve just to keep up?
Yeah, I mean, some aspects need to improve to keep up, but also I think there are opportunities to improve it. As a software developer, there are things that frustrate me, and there are things where I feel things could just be easier to do and less repetitive sometimes, and the tooling that is sort of available to us could be more helpful. So I think, and I think this sort of switch to doing things in the cloud, this ability to share a lot of stuff across developers, this ability to have many machines do things for you. I think that brings a lot of opportunities for exploring and rethinking the whole space, and thinking how can we improve things? How can we show the information to the developer they need to see? How can we help them understand what they're working on easily? How can we bring them the sort of standardized things that they need all the time? Take something as simple as integration testing. Everybody kind of does it a bit differently, and most developers aren't very skilled at it, and it's usually not so super easy to set up. And in the end, it's kind of the same. There are differences, obviously, but it's more or less a similar thing. And why can't we just have it automatically and out of the box? And I think there are many things like this that can kind of come standard and low cost or low cognitive load to the developer that could be improved.
Which means that the developer can then focus on doing, like, in inverted commas, the fun stuff.
That's my goal in life, to start doing the fun stuff. I swear I'm getting there every other day. Almost.
I mean, I think it definitely has taken me some time to kind of understand the full power of why it's important for a platform like Codesphere to have this, like, access to all these different machines behind the scenes, or like having all this power. Because as an individual developer, you're just like sit on your machine and you're kind of like happy to run your code and it's fine. But
I think you're not sitting there around and thinking, what else could this machine be doing it for me, right?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I think that's part of the problem. You get into your little kind of process and bubble, and you go, this is what software development is. And how much time do you actually spend thinking, hey, what could software development be?
Yeah.
Right.
How can we make it better? How can we, like, most people don't have 100 machines lying around at home that they can, use. And if you're doing stuff in the cloud, it's not unreasonable to ask what can we do if we had 100 machines available to us?
And that's kind of Codesphere, right?
That's kind of Codesphere.
Shout out to Codesphere.
That's kind of Codesphere.
But just to play devil's advocate, like, why is that useful?
For simple things, speeding up build time, right? Like, if I have one machine doing my builds, and one of the things, I guess, if you think about, your machine is mostly sitting around idle, right? Most of the time that you're idle, like the text editor doesn't do very much most of the time, and so you have these most instances where suddenly you need a lot of processing power where you're running a build, and so So actually, if you have 100 machines available to you and they're shared across 100 developers, you're not actually necessarily using more resources.
Okay.
Right? It's just that you're using them in a more concentrated way. When you need them, you have 100 machines, but maybe you have those 100 machines now for 1 second instead of having one machine for 100 seconds.
Okay.
And so problems like this. But I think that there's, other stuff like, how do you present information to the user? And what can you do with that? How can you? Because a lot of this kind of stuff is needs to be low latency. Like, right, if I have an IDE and I need to show sort of context specific or timely information to the user, it can't take me 10 seconds to figure out stuff out, right? Mm-hmm. The sort of very simple stuff you're familiar with is sort of the suggestions, the type suggestions that you get. I'm not using the correct technical term.
No, I think that's
the auto completion stuff.
Yeah.
The auto completion stuff that you get in the IDE. If it takes you 10 or 20 seconds to get that stuff, it's not really useful to you, right? Because you can then type faster than that. So that needs to be timely, and that means that if you suddenly have 100 machines available to you, then you can do much more within that 1 second, even if you're only using those machines for 1 second.
Yeah, okay.
And then you can sort of start to have your imagination run wild. What would I do? How can I speed up this developer's productivity? How can I make the code easier for them to understand? What context-specific information can I provide them? A lot of sort of reading and understanding code involves jumping around the place and looking at different parts. What if the IDE could just show you that stuff before you even think about jumping to it?
Yeah, cool.
Right? Or if you go with a sort of really more sci-fi kind of thing, imagine if we had eye tracking, right? And we could actually see where you're looking, right, in the code.
Can we do that Codesphere already? That'd be awesome.
and then you can use that to sort of show bits about the code for the developer. But maybe to do eye tracking, maybe you need more resources than your laptop. But when these things are available to you, you start to kind of think about, hey, what can you do with them? If you only have one machine, you feel constrained. You don't even explore the possibilities.
Yeah, that's super interesting because it's like you think that you're thinking outside the box. You think that you're kind of like, oh, maybe we could do this, but really it's like you're so constrained to the reality of just like, I just follow this process and this is the process that I do every day. But I guess that's like so applicable to so many startups, right? It's like you think that, if you can see that pivot or you can see that like workaround, then that's where the gold is. That's where if you can kind of work that angle out, and that's so useful, isn't it? But yes, it's very interesting. I hadn't even kind of considered all that stuff.
How does this apply to collaborative development in the cloud? Like how exactly is that going to look working with another developer on the same, maybe like on the same file in different branches, or how does it all come together if it's not offline in a local machine that's then pushed to a single code base, like say through GitHub or?
Well, I think those are things that are there to be explored. I mean, the kind of obvious stuff you can see is that you can edit the same source files together in real time. But that has many benefits in that you can maybe explore the source together. Right? If I need to explain something to someone and I need to walk them through the source code, it might be more useful if we're both looking at the same IDE and we're looking at the same code. And if I need to sort of show someone how to do changes, or where to change stuff, or how to modify something, or how something works, then having this ability for both of us to have a full-featured IDE interacting on the same level can be useful. But I think that's something we will see. I'm going perhaps to leave it at that. It's not. There are, I think, many opportunities in this space, and some of it just needs to be tested and figured out, right? Like experimented with and tried out. But certainly having a system where you can share, the individual development environments across many users, I think there is value there. It's a little bit like, when some big companies started to do gaming in the cloud, right? Now you suddenly start to think,
They will remain nameless, will they?
they will remain nameless, of course.
Use your imagination.
Then you start to think of new opportunities. How do you have people interact together? And I think probably, no one's really even scratched the surface of the possibilities. Think about what the world was like. At least I don't know what it's like, so to say, outside Google, but think about what it's like without Google Docs. Like, I cannot imagine collaborating on a document these days without some kind of real-time collaboration software. And I take it for granted nowadays, but surely it was, at some point in the past, this must have been really difficult.
And it also, even with what we were talking about again with Elias, the whole the iterative process with design. Being able to create a Figma file that you can then share seamlessly, and then get someone to interact with it, see how they're interacting with it, talk them through the process. Just wouldn't be possible, would it, without cloud-based solutions?
Yeah, and so if we do this in all these other aspects, why haven't we started doing this for code?
But why do you think we haven't done it for code, out of interest?
I don't think I have good answers for you here.
Okay.
I think some of it is simply that people are used to doing things in a certain way, and I think maybe it's not as like we already have sort of code review tooling, right? And so people are used to kind of this process of doing code reviews, whereas in systems which involve document collaboration or maybe Figma, there were less standard review processes, right? Like, you don't have a Figma review tool, right? You don't, before sort of systems like Google Docs, you didn't have a tool that allowed you to comment on stuff.
Yeah.
And so I think software already has tooling around the sort of more classical process. But these tools emerged a lot earlier, and they emerged before this kind of real-time collaboration stuff was around. And so perhaps that's one of the reasons where people haven't simply gone back and gone, hey, we now have these, we're no longer constrained to the kind of constraints that we were 10 or 20 years ago. How can we rethink this problem?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Perhaps that could be one of the reasons.
So this kind of like single code base, like on an individual machine, as it has been in the past, versus like this new cloud-based development process where you've got the code base living on hundreds of machines, comes with some like obvious advantages, like this single point of failure, right? So, I mean,
you mean
how do you feel about obvious disadvantages? Like if it goes down, then it's down everywhere. So let's say AWS recently had some big outages. How are we going to sidestep them if we move into this cloud development world? How do we counter it?
So I think in many ways this stuff isn't new, and it isn't sort of completely greenfield to have stuff living in the cloud, like some kind of cloud stuff and large cloud things, especially perhaps, as someone who spent the last decade working at Google, it doesn't feel new to me. But this kind of risk of single point of failure, I think some kind of risk will always exist. And so, one of the solutions here is to just be consistent about creating redundancy. So reducing the possibility that one system going down is going to take everything down. It's trying to reduce single points of failure, right? And pretty much sort of at every level. I don't think you will magically remove everything, right? But I think there are strategies to employ. The simplest of things, obviously, is replication, backing stuff up, having redundant systems spun up in case stuff goes down. I think at Google there are probably like full-time people who are walking around data centers and just replacing computer hard drives. Or at least they used to be, right? And you think, like, as a person using a computer, you never think that hard drive failure is something that's very rare. I've certainly had it happen to me once or twice, but it's not someone that most people experience. But on the scale of a Google data center, this happens all the time, right? And so there are software and to some extent hardware solutions, but for our software solutions that allow you to do sort of automatic failover and have systems that take over when something fails. That doesn't mean that at the software level you can't make mistakes. And so you need to, as I kind of mentioned before, mistakes can be very costly. And so you need to create processes around making sure that when you do releases, when you do upgrades, which is typically when these things happen, these things are done safely. And these things are, well verified. And so certainly one of the things I think Codesphere will concentrate on in the future is some kind of automatically safe deployment system that allows you to have some confidence that even your own software that you build has a level of safety associated with it, so it doesn't, so releases don't have this thing.
It's crazy on that front, like with Vercel, for example, and they're like the way that they ensure safety is basically they just built a JavaScript library that lets you use their software better. Like they created Next, so it uses their product in the best way, and I guess that must also mitigate loads of issues because you're not going to try and do anything crazy on there that they haven't thought of because of all the kind of logic is stuff that is the tools that they've given you.
Some of it can be mitigated by libraries and processes and automation and things like this. And I think this often happens even in the security world where if you take something as simple as SQL injection, you can completely mitigate this problem by using parameterized SQL statements and certain libraries for pretty much for any kind of class of this kind of problem. You have libraries that make it almost impossible to make these mistakes. And so certainly for some subclass of problems, it's just knowing where the solution is and how to deploy it and knowing it exists. But I think this is kind of where we come back to having experience as a sort of junior developer. You don't necessarily know all the ways that things can go wrong.
Right? I bet if you did, you wouldn't start in the first place.
Perhaps, I don't know. But we, after some time, you've seen stuff go wrong in so many different places that you kind of you've learned about this. You can kind of see, the things that as someone sort of starting out, you don't necessarily even think of. Where mistakes can hurt you. And I think this is partly because, we're there trying to develop things that work. We're not sitting around there thinking, how can this break?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
We're sitting there around thinking, how can we make this work? And in order to kind of see the issues, you kind of need to spend some time thinking about how can this break? Or how can I break this?
Yeah, I was going to say, even why would someone try and break it? I remember where I used to work, there was the first time we got like a DDoS attack on one of the sites that we had. And it's so weird to even think that would happen. And you're like, you just never presume. You're just like, oh yeah, no one's going to try and DDoS our website that's getting like, a few 100,000 visitors a year. And then suddenly you're just like, there's loads of traffic to this site. There's loads of traffic to this site. and then that's, then you've got to.
But, the other side of that in terms of finding flaws in your design, it's just 10 minutes with a user, right? And they'll immediately find something you wouldn't have thought of in.
I mean, that's of course something. But, I remember the days when passwords used to get sent around in clear text.
Yeah.
And these days you wouldn't
hash,
you wouldn't think about this ever happening.
The dark days pre-hash.
The developer's not going to look at it. They're not going to look at it.
all those machines and root, they're not going to.
No one's going to
spy on me. No one's going. So I mean, some of it is just that we've learned from our mistakes, but obviously part of it is actually communicating these things to the next generation of developers.
So do you think, to come back to startups and this cloud development, do you think that startups should be adopting this cloud development early on in their process? There's got to be a lot of arguments for and against.
I think it's going to become almost inevitable that this is, the way of doing things. I think it's probably, going to end up being sort of a competitive advantage to do stuff in the cloud. Just because, you have these systems where you can more or less use economies of scale to your advantage. You don't have that with local machines and local server farms and so on, and sort of every development of moving stuff in the cloud basically means that you have some kind of bit of software available to you, or even hardware, without the usual amount of maintenance, right? Which costs there. And so I think in general, anything in the cloud is just going to end up having these advantages where, one, obviously it has access to potentially many more resources, and probably, cheaper resources. Think about one thing that maybe cloud companies can do, and that is they can create data centers where electricity is cheap.
Oh yeah.
They can buy components en masse at a much discounted price, and they don't need all the same components that necessarily you do. I think these days most of the machines don't have some notion of computer cases, as you would say, and so all these kind of costs, I think, are just fundamentally smaller in the cloud world, and so. And you have the added benefits of the potential of having shared resources and higher utilization and higher peak power available to you. And so I think the cloud will almost be an inevitability. You use the cloud or you perish, so to speak. Maybe that's a bit fatalistic, and maybe there'll be some use cases where this is an exception, but I think that's where the trend will head.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah, that's really exciting. So, thank you so much for your time, today, Michal. That was great. What a journey! You see, I've never met anyone who was there like pre-hash.
It's been a pleasure.
You should put that on your business card. Like, I was there pre-hash.
Yeah, and I was there before the war came.
Yeah, you're just making me feel old now, I guess.
I would actually. I mean, to be, it might be a strange question to kind of level at someone in your position, but I wonder, like, what it's like to code with someone who's like yourself, who's been coding for so long. Like, is it? I've never coded with anyone who's more than like 3 or 4 years in, So is it just that you just write a function really fast, like lightning fast, like or is it that what kind of skills do you develop when you get like after a decade? Is it just your ability to read code and foresee problems, or?
Yeah, I think that's one aspect, is to be able to see things. I think fundamentally you don't get faster; you just do less.
This is what I mean. Yeah, like
I can't. I'm sure I can't type faster than anyone who is younger.
That's exactly my question. Once you speak English, you speak it.
Yeah, but the thing is that you make fewer mistakes, and you need to redo things, and you fundamentally. I think what you end up doing is you end up doing less work to achieve the same results.
Mm. And I guess with a startup, that's like crucial, isn't it?
Yeah. If you can avoid, I think that's fundamentally how you make progress faster, is you avoid doing unnecessary work. You avoid making unnecessary mistakes. You avoid, doing things that you don't need to do or that aren't actually beneficial to solving your goal. And I think that's where fundamentally the experience brings you, just because you have seen so much more stuff. And hopefully, once you've made the same mistakes 2 or 3 times, you don't make them again. Hopefully, and
that is a fantastic piece of advice for any startups out there listening. And a great place to end it.
What's the advice?
To try and get more work done with the least amount of effort. Learn from your mistakes and make less mistakes moving forward. I mean, it's an individual like goal as a developer, but if you're a startup listening out there, that's what you should be striving for as a company and as a development team through your whole processes, really. So, well, that was my takeaway, Tim. I don't know what you were.
It's just funny, the whole like it's mistakes. It's just like I don't know. It's strange, isn't it? Because sometimes even things take you might think you've done it right, but like it's such a grey area of like progress and like what you're actually trying to achieve. And sometimes by making the mistakes and actually getting it wrong a few times, you actually learn way more than just being like, and now I've done it.
Yeah. And so I think my underlying point there is unnecessary mistakes. Right?
It's true. Some are unnecessary. That's right. Yeah.
I guess that's the difference between mistakes and errors. Apparently, that's the difference.
Yeah, I don't know. There are things that you couldn't have known ahead of time, right?
Yeah.
And there are things that you could, and those things that you could, you can do more effectively and better. And those things that you couldn't have known ahead of time, that those are your experiments, and those are the things you hopefully still learn from, right? But you try stuff out and you see if it works, and if it doesn't, you try something else, and you develop hopefully then systems that are more usable and better than if you hadn't tried at all, or if you had decided that you know better.
Very cool. Awesome. Thanks so much. That's all. I think every single talking point we could have recorded an episode about.
Yeah.
I was really itching to dive in every single time, but then next time we'll have to get you back. Lots of times.
Thank you for your insight on developer experience. I'm really looking forward to what you do with Codesphere.
Thanks. No, it's been fun. I would take this to mean that I'm good at rambling on.
You can join our elite crew of ramblers.
Yeah, ramblers make perfect podcast guests.